Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This webinar is a collaboration between the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. My name is Nicholas Walters, and I am one of the outreach specialists in CFBNP. I will be your moderator this afternoon. As a note, everyone's mic has been muted. If you have any questions during today's presentation, please type your question in the Q&A box to the right of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, the presenter will provide the appropriate response. And as another reminder, this is a live recording. Before we get started, I would like to introduce Mr. Conrad Washington. He is the director for the VA Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Conrad Washington serves as our director here at the VA Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Mr. Washington retired from the United States Marine Corps with 20 years of active duty service with a combat tour in 2004. Mr. Washington is a licensed minister, actively serving in his faith. He received his master's degree of divinity in pastoral studies from Moody Theological Seminary. He also holds a master's in business administration and a bachelor's degree in education. Additionally, he is a graduate of VA's class of 2017's Virtual Inspiring Leaders Program. At this time, I present Mr. Washington.
Hey, thank you, Nicholas. I appreciate it. Thank each of you for joining us. Once again, I always joke around about the buffet of webinars today. So I thank you for stopping at this particular restaurant and getting fed some information I think is really important. I want to thank Lillie Mells, our presenter today, once again, who's going to give us some great information regarding suicide prevention. I know many are coming out of Lent, still remembering their holiday, but also Ramadan is still going on. So we are sensitive to that, and we appreciate you, partaking with us today. And I will share that anti-Semitism, as we talk about all the things that's going in the nation, and there's a lot of things going on. Anti-Semitism across the nation is growing and is threatening the safety and security of Jewish people. The hate has surfaced so much that President Biden established a working group to counter anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination and bias. This hate is being exposed by extremist groups and individuals from online and in person. But we must be able to bring people together from all backgrounds, all faith, all ethnicities, in order to serve our veterans, their families, caregivers, and beneficiaries. I wish I could have a slogan that everyone would take to heart, which is just respect diversity, but that's not the world we live in. But please be aware that we need your support so that we can continue to serve our veterans and their families. Today, Lillie is going to continue to share, as she always does, great information about suicide, that it's a national health crisis, that it's preventable. She's going to provide some great resources and information. So I hope that you find the information is great, because we need you. We cannot do it alone. So we need you to help us support this great initiative as we know that it impacts the nation as well. So thank you all for joining us. Back to you, Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Washington. Now at this time, I will introduce Ms. Lillie Mells. Lillie Mells is the Program Manager in Education Training for Office in Mental Health and Suicide Prevention. Lillie Mells is a licensed clinical social worker and is board certified, a diplomat in social work with over 20 years of experience. She has worked in various capacities to include child abuse, domestic violence, and substance abuse. Lillie is an Air Force veteran and has served as Director of Psychological Health for Virginia Air National Guard. Lillie has been with the Department of Veterans Affairs since 2013, working in suicide prevention. At this time, I present to you Ms. Lillie Mells.
Thank you, Mr. Washington, and thank you, Mr. Walters. It's a pleasure always to be here and bring forth good information to our folks on the line. So as we get started, I do like to know who's in the audience. So I always like to have folks type in the box what branch of service they're from. So do we have any Army folks in the house today? You can just type in the Q&A box if you're Army. Any Navy folks? Any Marines? We got at least 3 Marines in the house today. Any of my brothers and sisters in blue, Air Force? Anyone from the Guard and Reserve or the Coast Guard? Okay, so I think my Navy buddy over there and myself, I think we're outnumbered. We got more Marines in the house than anyone else. But oh, I got Navy Army. Okay, great. So the reason I like to find out what branch of service people have served in is because each branch has their own mission and what they bring to the table. And so I'm just deeply appreciative of all branches of the military. I served alongside each branch when I deployed, and you have a deeper appreciation for each branch because you know exactly what they bring to the table. So thank all of you, and thank you for sharing. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to do our VA SAVE training. So before we begin, I'd like to just share with you that sometimes talking about suicide can be very difficult for many. We're not going to have any gory details or anything like that. But if you do need to take a break and step out, please do so. The National Prevention Suicide Lifeline is 988. We have moved from the 1-800-273-8255 and to now 988. Also, if you're a veteran and you want to call the Veterans Crisis Line, just dial 988. So it's a simpler way for folks to get help immediately. Next slide. So this is what we're going to cover today. Facts about veteran suicide, common myths and realities about suicide, the VA SAVE training, which is our gatekeeper training, and then I'll provide some resources. Next slide. So once you finish this training, you'll have a general understanding of the scope of suicide within the U.S., how to identify someone who may be at risk for suicide, and what to do when you do identify someone at risk for suicide. Next slide, please. So my next question to you all is, what are your biggest questions about talking to someone in crisis? What is your biggest questions about suicide and talking to someone in crisis? And so if you could think about that question, write it down, and then hopefully by the time we finish this training, that question would have been answered for you. Next slide. So let's go over some facts about veteran suicide. So as we know, suicide is a national public health problem as far as the VA is concerned. It's a national issue with rising rates in the general population as well as veterans. For every death by suicide, there's at least 135 individuals that are impacted. And I would venture to say that in some cases is even more than that. When you think about the individual, their families, their friends, people they associate with, people in their community, even if they just go to the local grocery store, you know how many people may know that individual, especially if they go there on a regular basis. So I would venture to say that it probably is a little bit more than 135, but at minimum we know is at least 135. So suicide is a complex issue with no single cause. If we had a single cause, we could probably combat this problem immediately. But suicide is often the result of complex interaction of risks and protective factors at the individual, community, and societal level. Risk factors are those things that associate with challenges that increase the likelihood of suicidal behavior. These are those obstacles, those challenges that people face on a day-to-day basis. Protective factors can offset risk factors. Protective factors are those tools, those skills, those things that we can use to offset a crisis. So to prevent suicide, we have to maximize protective factors and minimize the risk factors at all levels throughout communities nationwide. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go over some of our risk factors and protective factors. One thing I like to say about this particular slide is that it's not all inclusive. These are some of the ones that we see on a regular basis, but it's not all inclusive. And believe me, there's a lot more things that we can put on this slide. We just can't fit them all in, but there's a lot more that we can put on here. So let's start with the risk factors. So remember what I said a moment ago. Risk factors are those challenges, those obstacles, those things that get in the way of people living a normal, productive life. They're challenges, they're crises, they're things that aid to the behaviors that lead to suicide. So the first thing we have on the list is a prior suicide attempt. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will go on to have another attempt. However, those that have had a prior suicide attempt, it does put them at a greater risk than someone who is not engaged in that behavior. Next, mental health issues. When we talk about mental health issues, we're talking about those untreated mental health issues. So if you have someone who has long-standing depression, never received any treatment for it, anxiety, no treatment for it, other mental health disorders, alcoholism, drug abuse, these things really need treatment. And so the longer they go untreated, the greater the risk for suicide becomes. Next, substance abuse. I mentioned substance abuse briefly, but it is part of the mental health family. So when you have untreated substance abuse, it definitely puts you at a greater risk. When we talk about using substances, we're talking about things that are going to alter your mood, alter your judgment. And anytime your mood and your judgment is altered, it definitely puts you at a greater risk for suicide. Next, access to lethal means. When we talk about lethal means now, especially when it comes to suicide in our population, we're talking about access to weapons, guns. Guns are the number one method being used for suicide. And so when you have access to this type of lethal means, it definitely puts you at a greater risk. There are some other lethal means out there, overdose on medications, stockpiles of medication, things like that. But the number one lethal mean in our society is weapons. And I'll talk a little bit more later about what the VA is doing regarding lethal means training, lethal means safety, and lethal means storage. Next, recent loss. So when we talk about recent loss, it could be loss of a life, it could be loss of a limb, it could be loss of one of your senses. So when you have a recent loss, it can mean catastrophic things for people, and it really can put people at risk for suicide. Next, legal or financial issues. So when we talk about legal issues, especially when the possibility of facing jail time, it can be very scary for a lot of people, just the thought of going to prison and how will they cope. And so it could put someone in a place where they become suicidal. Next, financial issues. So when you're facing financial challenges, bankruptcy, foreclosure, those kinds of things, it definitely puts you at risk for suicide. Next on the list, relationship issues. And when we talk about relationship issues, those relationships that fail. And a lot of times in society, you'll see when someone has a failed relationship, they find themselves unable to cope with it. So when you have a failed relationship, sometimes it feels like you're going through the grieving process. The same steps of the grieving process are very similar to when you're going through a relationship loss. Sometimes there's denial, there's shame, there's guilt, there's anger. These are the same emotions that you go through during the grieving process. Sometimes it can become very volatile, and you'll see in some cases you'll have murder suicide over a relationship. So it definitely puts that person at a greater risk. Unemployment. If you're unable to take care of yourself or your family, it definitely puts you at a greater risk. And then homelessness. And as I said earlier, there are a lot more things that can go on that list, but we can't fill up the entire page, but there's a lot more things that can go on that list. So now let's move over to the other side of the page and look at protective factors. So remember, I said protective factors are those skills, those tools that you can use, those problem-solving skills that you can use to overcome challenges and situations where you might be overwhelmed. So access to mental health care. This is definitely a positive protective factor. When you have access to treatment, that means you can get help for those issues instead of allowing them to fester and go untreated. So access to mental health care. It always puts an individual in a better position because there are some mental health issues that can't just be treated by therapy alone. Some people require medication, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. Those are types of mental health issues that require medication and stabilization. Okay. And even anxiety and depression. Some people may need medication for that. So if you're engaged in mental health treatment and you're receiving the therapy and the medication, is definitely going to put you in a positive light. Sense of connectedness. So when we talk about sense of connectedness, we're definitely talking about folks once they leave the military. So I know when I was serving, you have a unit, you have people in your unit, you work with these individuals every single day, you know what the mission is, you know why you're there and what you're supposed to do. And there is a sense of connectedness because you're there and you know exactly who your team is. And so for a lot of people, when they leave the military, they don't necessarily have that connectiveness anymore. I mean, think about it. If you join the military at 18, 19 years old and you spend 20 years serving, that's half of your adult life. Most of your friends are going to be in the military. I mean, unless you go back to a couple of childhood friends and high school friends, most of your friends are going to be in that military, and that's where your connective piece is going to be. So staying connected is very powerful. Next, problem solving skills. I always get a big laugh out of this because I tell the team here that, I grew up in New York City and we didn't have a whole lot of problem solving skills. There was only one way we knew how to solve problems. Anybody in the audience know how we solved problems when we were kids? Type your answer in the chat box. Problem solving skills. There was only one way we knew how to solve problems. And that was to put up our fists and fight. And I will tell you, it's not a good problem solving skill. It really isn't. And one of the things about problem solving is that if we learn how to problem solve at a young age, our lives will probably be very different. You know, I grew up in an era that there was no problem solving other than fighting. And so as people got older, instead of physically fighting, they verbally fought, but it's not a good way to solve problems. And if you can learn how to problem solve, then you can probably navigate during challenges and times that are tough. So problem solving, positive skill to have. Next, sense of spirituality. So spirituality is very individualized. It means different things for different people. Some people will do formal practice of religion. Some people will actually go to a house of worship. Some people will actually read and study the Bible. Some people will meditate. It just depends on what works for the individual. And for some people, it won't work for them, but it's very individualized, but it can be a protective factor for many. Next, mission or purpose. So one thing about the military is that there's always a mission out there. No matter what branch you served in, there is a mission and there's a purpose. And sometimes when you leave the military, it's not always clear as to what your mission or purpose is. In the military, our mission is to get the enemy, and so when you're not serving or you've done your career in the military, what's my mission now? What's my mission now? And what's my purpose now? And you will find that a lot of military folks will join agencies that help other veterans. It gives us a purpose to give back and help those that are still out there serving. Next, physical health. So when we talk about physical health, you need to be getting your annual physicals, your annual checkups, annual exams that need to be done, and then also take care of those ailments that have been lingering. When I served in the military, I was good to go. Had no issues, thought I was on top of the world. When I got out, I had more pain than I ever thought. And I was like, what happened? Because we're so busy focused on the mission, you're not really taking care of your body. And so it's not a good idea to walk around in pain every day. Really, you need to get those issues taken care of, get treatment for them, and make sure that you're going on a regular basis. And it's tough when you're walking around in pain every day. Next, employment. When you're gainfully employed, it's definitely a protective factor. You can support yourself, you can support your family, you can do some of the leisure things that you may want to do. The opposite of that is unemployment. If you're unable to support yourself and your family, it can be very difficult. Just imagine looking in your child's eyes and you're unable to buy them food or clothing. So employment is definitely a positive protective factor. Next, social and emotional well-being. You definitely want to be able to engage in activities that's going to enhance your well-being. and socially keep connected. And that's why a lot of veterans you'll find are working in an industry that helps other veterans, whether it's the VA or continuing to work for DOD or some sort of organization that helps veterans, because we want to stay healthy and we want to help those that are still serving. And so sometimes to do that, really socially, you have to get out there and you have to put yourself out there and be willing, to help and stay connected. And so overall, we have to minimize the risk factors. And remember what I said those are. These are those things that are challenges, they're obstacles, things that get in the way of our daily lives and hinders us from being productive. And then we must increase the protective factors. These are the tools, the skills, the things that we can use to help us navigate when there's a problem. Next slide. So now we're going to look at some of the lethal means and the percentage of suicide deaths and the methods involved. Now, this slide is a little bit old and we do have some updated material coming. But remember earlier I said guns, firearms. It's the number one method that's being used for suicide. So let's start with firearms and non-veteran adults. So almost 48% of non-veteran adults are using firearms. The next category is veterans. Almost 70% of veterans are using firearms as a means of suicide. Non-veteran women, 31%. Veteran women, look at that number. Almost 50% of veteran women are using guns as a means of suicide. Non-veteran men, 53%, and then our veteran men, 70%. So you see how this is a huge number, and the VA has really had to educate not only veterans, their family members, their caregivers, as well as our providers who are providing services to veterans on lethal means safety, and lethal means safety storage. And so the VA has really taken a stance on this to really increase the knowledge among all. And now if you look at the list, poisoning, suffocation, and other methods, and other could be a variety of things. It could be jumping from a height. It could be ramming a vehicle into a fixed object. But if you look at all three of those other categories, they don't even come close, not even close to firearms. So firearms is the number one method that's being used. Okay, next slide. So lethal means safety. So what is lethal means safety? So in the context of suicide prevention, safe storage of lethal means is any action that builds in time and space between a suicidal impulse and the ability to harm oneself. So I'll repeat that. It's any action that builds in time and space between a suicidal impulse and the ability to harm oneself. So if you have a gun storage cabinet, if you have a gun lock, if you have a safety mechanism on that gun, it builds in time and space between when that person has that thought and the ability to hurt themselves. And so effective lethal means safety education and counseling. It's collaborative, veteran-centered, and it respects the important role of firearms and medications, the role that they play in a veteran's life. And remember I said earlier, the VA has really foot stomped this, and we have really pushed to educate veterans, family members, and caregivers and providers on lethal means safety. It's really because, a lot of our providers are not people that have weapons or have handled weapons. And so really to educate them on what this means to someone who has a weapon. Initially the VA's thought was if someone has a weapon and they were in a suicidal crisis or a mental health crisis, the first thing that was done is that the authorities were called, the weapon was removed, it was confiscated, and the person never got the weapon back. What we found is that it really didn't work, because then people began to be dishonest about whether they had a weapon or not. They wouldn't be forthcoming if they knew that the weapon was going to be confiscated. So we had to change that thinking to say, okay, we understand that you own a weapon. You're going through a crisis. Let's give you these options. How about we safely secure that weapon, lock it up, give the key to a trusted adult who's over 18 who could safely secure it until you get through this crisis. And that seemed to work better than just to confiscate completely. And so that's the new education piece that we have done with veterans and their caregivers and family members. Next slide. So these are some examples, and most suicidal crises are brief. The time from decision to action is usually less than 1 hour. And so here are some of the percentages right here. Less than 5 minutes, 24%. Less than 20 minutes, 48%. And within an hour, 71%. But the key is to build in time and space between the thought and the actual action. Next slide. So lethal means safety, it does work. So reducing access to lethal suicide methods is one of the few population level interventions that has been shown to decrease suicide rates. And about 90% of people who survive a suicide attempt do not necessarily go on to die by suicide. So what we have learned for this is that we have to collaborate with veterans ahead of time, their families, the caregivers, and the providers to help them through a suicidal crisis. And if we've done that, we're likely to prevent a suicide crisis for the rest of their lives. So that's what we're working towards. Next slide. Suicide is preventable. So now I'm gonna ask you guys some questions, and I want you to type your answer in the box, and we'll see how well you're doing. So next slide. Our first question is, people who talk about suicide are just seeking attention. Is that a myth or reality? Go ahead and type it in the Q&A box. People who talk about suicide are just seeking attention. Myth or reality? Okay, I see one myth in there. I see reality. I see myth. Okay, you're on it. Okay, let me give you the answer to that. It's a myth. Because no matter how casually or jokingly said, suicide threats should never be ignored, and they may indicate serious suicidal feelings. So someone who talks about suicide, it provides others an opportunity to intervene before those behaviors occur. So let me give you an example of that. So let's say you have a friend, John. John agrees to meet you for lunch today. You work in different buildings, different offices. They're going to meet you at 12:30 for lunch today. So you meet up with John, you're walking to the restaurant, and you say to John, how's that divorce going? And he says, I'm so over this divorce, I'm going to lose my house, I'm going to lose the car, the visitation is going to be cut, I'm only going to see the kids once a month, I'm so over this, I could just jump in front of that bus. Now, John may not have a plan or intent to jump in front of that bus, but clearly he's telling you he's overwhelmed. He's facing all these issues, financial issues, visitation with his children. He has a lot going on. And he's saying to you, I could just jump in front of that bus. He may not have intent to do that, but clearly he's overwhelmed with a lot that's going on. Next slide. Myth or reality? The only one who can really help someone who is suicidal is a mental health counselor or therapist. Is that a myth or reality? Okay, I see a lot of myths in the box. Okay, next slide. So it's a myth because special training is not required to safely raise the subject of suicide. So helping someone feel included and showing genuine, heartfelt support can also make a big difference during a challenging time. And I will tell you this, I've done this a long time, and many times if you just become a good listener, validate that person and what's going on with them, you will have gone a long way. So you don't need to be a professional counselor to do this or to help someone overcome a crisis. Next slide. So now I'm going to go over the steps of S.A.V.E. And this is, as I said earlier, is the VA's gatekeeper training. It's really our entry-level suicide prevention training. Next slide. So S.A.V.E. It's teaching communities how to help veterans at risk for suicide, but you guys can use this to help anyone who's at risk for suicide. It's going to help you act with compassion and care if you encounter someone who's in a suicidal crisis. So the first thing is S, signs of suicidal thinking should be recognized. A, ask the most important question of all. Does anybody out there know what the most important question of all is? What's that question? Type it in the chat box. Ask the most important question of all. B, validate the person's experience. E, encourage treatment and expedite getting help. So I see a few people have typed in the questions what the most important question of all is, and I'm going to get to that in a few moments. Next slide. So S, signs of suicidal thinking. Learn how to recognize these warning signs. These are warning signs. Hopelessness. And you will see a lot of that when someone is suicidal. Hopelessness. They're hopeless about their situation. They feel like there's no way out. Nothing can change. Anxiety. Anxiety is that feeling of nervousness. Something's about to happen. Not sure what, not sure who, not sure when. Some people will have physical symptoms. Some people will feel nauseated. Some people will have sweaty palms. Some people will have a racing heart rate and feel like they're having a full-blown panic attack. You may see agitation, sleeplessness, or mood swings, feeling like there's no reason to live. You may also see some rage and anger, engaging in risky activities without thinking. And there's a lot of activities out there that people have engaged in. I've seen people riding motorcycles, high rates of speed, no helmet, weaving in and out of traffic. This is very risky behavior. Increasing alcohol and drug use. And remember what I said before, anytime you engage in alcohol and drug use, these are mood altering substances. And anytime you alter your mood, you alter your judgment as well. Withdrawing from family and friends. Next slide. More signs of suicidal thinking. So the presence of any of the following signs require immediate attention. So thinking about hurting or killing themselves. Looking for ways to die. And believe me, there's 1,000,001 things that you can do to the 10th power. So if you have someone who's in a suicidal crisis and you're with them, don't leave them alone. Even if you think, oh, well, there's nothing in the room, they'll be okay. Believe me, they can find something in that room. We have seen it. Okay? Talking about death, dying, or suicide, self-destructive or risk-taking behaviors, especially when it involves alcohol, drugs, or weapons. Okay? Next slide. Know how to ask the most important question of all. So I looked in the chat and I saw some of the questions that you guys had in there. Are you thinking about hurting yourself? How can I help you? Are you thinking of harming yourself? Asking their feelings? Have you ever considered suicide? So let me give you the answer. Know how to ask the most important question of all. And that question is, are you thinking about killing yourself? This is the question that you want to ask, and you want to ask it exactly the way it's written. Are you thinking about killing yourself? The reason we want to ask this question this way is because we don't want to make any mistake about what we're asking that person and the answer that they give us. See, because if I say to you, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Well, hurting can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. Burning your leg with a cigarette could be hurting yourself, So someone who's thinking about killing themselves, they may not think, you said hurt. Well, hurt can be a lot of different things. So you want to ask that question, are you thinking about killing yourself? And this way, they're only going to be able to give you one answer. Okay? And that'll be a universal answer, either yes or no. Next slide. So there are some things that you want to consider when you're asking that question. You do want to ask that question if you identify warning signs or symptoms. So let's go back to John. John gave you a list of things that's going on with him. He's going through a divorce. He's going to lose his house. He's going to have visitation issues. He's going through all of this stuff. So clearly, and then he said he could just jump in front of that bus. So clearly there's some warning signs there with John. Then, as I said before, he may not have a plan or intent to commit suicide, but he has all of the symptoms that are there, the warning signs. And so you want to go ahead and ask. And do ask the question in a natural way that it flows with the conversation. So clearly, with the scenario I gave of John, that's, where you can go ahead and ask that question. Now let's change it up a bit. So if John had said to you, yeah, I'm going through the divorce, I have to give up one of the vehicles. I'm going to have to move out the house. I want the kids to stay in their school. So I'm going to, let the wife have the house. But, I'll get over it. Visitations will be once a month, but, I'll make the best of it. Now, in that situation, he has a lot going on, but he didn't give you any indication that he's overwhelmed and that he's having these thoughts about suicide. Okay? So you want to make sure it flows naturally with the conversation. Now, there are some don'ts. You don't want to ask the question as though you're looking for a no answer. So if I'm looking for a no answer, this is how I would pose the question to John. I would say, John, you aren't thinking of killing yourself, are you? So if I say you're not thinking of killing yourself, I've already put the answer in the question. So there's no way John could be honest and give me an honest answer. Okay? So if you say you aren't thinking of killing yourself, I'll give you another example. My daughter, she likes to wear these shoes, Crocs, Crocs. I don't like the shoes. I don't think they're real shoes. I think they belong on the beach. I don't think they're made for human walking, but that's just me. But any opportunity she gets, she wants to wear those shoes. So if I don't want her to wear those shoes, this is how I would respond to her. I would say, Nicole, you're not wearing those shoes, are you? If I say, Nicole, you're not wearing those shoes, I've already told her she's not wearing those shoes. So the only answer that she could give me is, no, ma'am, I'm not wearing those shoes, because I just told her she's not wearing those shoes. If I wanted her to select the type of shoes she wanted to wear, then I would rephrase the question and say, Nicole, what shoes are you wearing today? And then she would have the freedom to choose which shoes she wanted to wear. So you want to make sure you ask the question where you give that individual an opportunity to give their honest answer back. And don't wait to ask the question when someone is halfway out the door. So if you're with John, you already had lunch, but this is lingering in the back of your mind. He said something about jumping in front of the bus. Now you wait till the meal is over. You've got 5 minutes to get back to work. John, are you thinking of killing yourself? John might say yes. Now what happens? Now you have to stop everything because you need to intervene here. So you want to make sure that you give yourself enough time. Ask that question as early as possible when you've identified those warning signs. Next slide. B, validate that person's experience. I can't emphasize anymore how it is crucial to validate someone's experience. When you validate someone, you let them know that they matter, their opinion matters, and it just makes them feel like, somebody gets me, somebody understands, or somebody is willing to understand or willing to listen. So you want to validate them. Talk openly about suicide. Be willing to listen and allow that person to express his or her own feelings. Recognize that the situation is serious, because it is. Don't pass judgment. One thing we know about human beings is that most of us are very good at reading people. And if we're being judged, we can sense it really quickly. And if the person feels that they're being judged, they will shut down. So don't pass judgment, and reassure them that help is available. Okay? Next slide. E, encourage treatment and expedite getting help. So what should you do if you think someone is suicidal? Don't keep it a secret. This is not the type of secret that you want to keep. And we do have people who say, I'm going to tell you something, but you have to swear to me that you're not going to say anything. At 3:00 today, I'm going to kill myself. That's not a secret you want to keep. That person may be mad at you, they may be upset, but you're going to get them the help they need. And we have seen it where people have gotten the help and they have come back and apologized. Okay? Don't leave him or her alone. I mentioned it earlier. Just because you think the room is empty, believe me, there's something in that room that they can use. So don't leave him or her alone. Try to get the person to seek immediate help from his or her own doctor or the nearest emergency room. Call 911. Reassure them that help is available. Call the Veterans Crisis Line. Remember, we've gone from 1-800-273-8255 to now 988, which has made it easier, simpler for someone in crisis to get help. Just press 988. It goes to the National Crisis Line. If you're a veteran or service member, press 1, and they'll get connected to a responder who's a VA or a veteran responder. Next slide. What to do when you're talking with someone at risk for suicide. The first thing you want to do is remain calm. Don't get all excited and riled up because that's not going to help the situation. So just be calm. Listen more than you speak. Allow that person to vent. Allow them to state to you what they feel is going on. It doesn't matter whether they're right or wrong. Let them have their moment. Listen more than you speak. Maintain good eye contact. The worst thing that could happen is somebody's pouring out their heart and you're looking at a phone or a book or something else. Maintain good eye contact. Act with confidence. You may not know everything to do, but act with confidence. Don't argue with that individual. Stay away from all those controversial topics. Politics, religion, gun control. Stay away from all of that because everyone has dug their heels in. It's a no-win situation. Use open body language. Don't be like Macaulay Culkin on Home Alone with the shock face. Limit your questions. Let that individual do the talking. Use supportive and encouraging comments, but be honest that there's no quick solution, but help is available. We have seen it at the VA where people have called, come in and said, I'm 8 months behind on my mortgage. If you don't help me, I'm going to kill myself. The reality is the VA is not going to pay 8 months of anybody's mortgage. However, there are some programs out there to help. And if you're 8 months behind on your mortgage, it's going to take at least 8 months to clean it up. So we want to be honest. We don't want to give them this illusion that everything is going to be changed overnight. Next slide. What do you do if someone expresses suicidal ideation during a phone call? You want to keep that call on the line. Don't hang up or transfer the call. And I will tell you, for most of us that work in an office, it's not an easy thing to transfer those calls. I know me personally, I don't transfer enough calls throughout the year to become really good at it. And so every opportunity I get to transfer a call, you can believe somebody's going to get hung up on because I just don't do it enough. So you want to keep that person on the line. You want to remain calm. Get as much identifying information on that caller that you can. Doesn't matter if you only got a few things. If you can get a name, even if they give you their nickname, it doesn't matter. Just get as much information as you can and their current location. You can conference call to the Veterans Crisis Line, but I will tell you, you have to be very savvy at this and know how to do it. There is a way that you can call the crisis line, have that phone ring, and still be on the line with the caller, and then merge the two calls. But you have to be really good at that. And I will tell you, for a lot of us that work at the VA, our call center folks and our operators, they're the ones that transfer a lot of these calls. Okay. You can also enlist coworkers for assistance via instant messaging and Teams, or use your cell phone, text someone. If you're on the line and someone is in crisis and you need help, use the tools that you have available to you. If you work in an office where you have Microsoft Teams, you can look and see who's at work today. They don't even have to be in the same city. You can just message them and say, I need help. I have so-and-so on the line. This is what I need you to do. So be able to do that. If the caller disconnects, you want to go ahead and call them back immediately. If you get no answer, then you want to go ahead and dial 911. Let them know that you were on the line with someone and they got disconnected and you would like to do a welfare check. You have some concern. Once you've done that, then go ahead and dial 988, the Veterans Crisis Line, and give them the same information because they're going to reach out as well. So we just want to make sure that we're able to do that. And since the number is 988 now, it will be a lot more convenient. Next slide. So that was the steps of S.A.V.E. Signs of suicidal thinking should be recognized. Ask the most important question of all. That question is, are you thinking of killing yourself? Validate that person's experience. Let them know that they matter and their voice matters. Encourage treatment and expedite getting help. Next slide. So now I'm going to go over some resources that we have available at the VA. They're all basically free resources. So I mentioned earlier the Veterans Crisis Line. The crisis line operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Dial 988. If it's a veteran or active duty service member, press number 1. Anyone can call the crisis line, veterans, family members, service members, friends. You can even call anonymous. Doesn't matter. Anybody can call. Next slide. So what is 988? 988 is the new mental health crisis number. It's a national number. So the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, it's the same number. The only difference is for veterans, you just press number 1. This number came into enactment in July of 2022. The old 10-digit number will still be in effect. It'll take a couple of years to phase it out in every state. So you could still dial either or. We're just encouraging people to dial the 988 because it's much easier, much quicker, less numbers to remember. Next slide. This is the crisis line. So the crisis line was stood up in 2007 and has been going strong ever since. We've had over 6 million calls, over 730,000 chats, over 253,000 texts, over 1 million referrals. And when we talk about referrals, these are referrals that go to suicide prevention coordinators at the Veterans Hospital. And then over 230,000 dispatches of emergency services. And this is when EMS and police actually go out to the individual. Next slide. Don't wait, reach out. So this is a website where you could, it's like a one-stop shop. You can go on this website if you're a veteran and you're looking for VA resources. So let's say you want something in education, you click on check the box education. If you want something on financial literacy, you check on financial. If you need medical care, you check on medical. Once you press submit, then one compile list will show up for you. So you'll get one list of resources, even after you press several options that you need. Next slide. Make the connection. So this is an online resource with veterans telling their stories about overcoming mental health challenges. And it's a really good tool because you have people speaking from the heart and it encourages others to seek help. Next slide. National Shooting and Sports Foundation and American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and VA Partnership. So we've partnered with these agencies. You will see on your TV during maybe some big events like Super Bowl, NASCAR events, maybe some basketball games, you will see some ads for lethal means safety, those type of things. And so we're really glad that we have this partnership because the Sports and Shooting Foundation is huge. And so to be able to partner with them and have them actually give out gun locks and crisis information is great. Next slide. KeepItSecure.net. So this is another practice safe storage of firearms, medication, and other lethal means. And also, again, with the National Sports and Shooting Foundation as well. Next slide. So earlier I talked about how we had to educate veterans, their caregivers, family members, and our providers. And so we've had new lethal means safety resources and training and just educating all involved. And so it has made a difference. Next slide. Here are some of our mobile apps that anyone can use. You can just download them on your phone. One of the things I recommend is that if you are in treatment, you can use these apps, but I would use it in conjunction with your therapist. The apps aren't made to work just alone, so use it in conjunction with your therapist. Next slide. Safety plan. So this is a safety plan. A safety plan is a written list of resources and things that people can do when they're in a crisis. And so now you can actually have a safety plan on your phone. So when you're in a crisis, you can actually go to that safety plan and look at some of the things you have listed. These are distractors, things that can distract you from that crisis. And we recommend that this is done with your therapist as well. Next slide. Coaching in the care. So this is a resource for families of veterans who would like to get that member into care and the member is refusing. So it gives them some key options of how they can get that member into care. They can speak directly to a counselor on the phone. And coaching in the care, they'll actually talk to the veteran if need be. So it's a good resource. Next slide. Postvention resources. We don't talk about postvention a lot, but it's a reality in our communities. And so we have to be prepared, communities, providers, and workplace. We have to be prepared. So this is where you have those resources of suicide, post-suicide. So they're there on this website from our MyRec, and they're actually free resources. Next slide. So this S.A.V.E training I just gave, it is online through Psych Armor Institute, which is one of our partners. It's free. All you have to do is register online and they can provide the training for free. It's about 25 minutes and we just encourage, communities to take the training, clergy, schools, just anyone that wants to get information on suicide prevention, go ahead and take the training. Next slide. So that's it for the briefing. I will turn it back over to Mr. Walters.
Thank you, Ms. Mills. At this time, normally we would address the questions in the Q&A box, but we don't have any. So I would like to just thank everybody for joining today's webinar. Before we end today's webinar, I'd like to turn it back over to Mr. Washington, who might have some closing remarks.
Thanks, Nicholas. Once again, Lillie, thank you for your very informative and meticulous brief, great information, and I'm sure that everyone appreciates it. For all of you, thank you for joining us today. We're having another webinar Wednesday, May 3rd for pre-need and burial benefits. We look forward to you all joining us. Have a safe and blessed rest of your week.
If you register for this event, we would like to provide today's presentation. We'll provide it at a later date. Please subscribe to our website, Facebook for future webinars, and this adjourns today's meeting and have a good afternoon.